Tonight on Greater Boston, the head of Mayor Wu's COVID-19 Advisory Committee, Dr. Bisola Ojikutu, joins me to talk about Boston's vaccine mandate, the impact on restaurants and other venues, along with the pushback from city employees, and when will it end? Then later, how do you fight the most vicious anti-vaxxer propaganda when it comes from a guy with 11 million listeners on Spotify, and another man from a famous family making Holocaust comparisons? We'll hear from the CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate and Journalism, Imran Ahmed, and journalism professor Jeffrey Blevins. As of today, Cambridge-based Moderna's COVID vaccine has joined Pfizer's in having official full FDA approval after more than a year of emergency authorization. And new data out from the CDC today is proving what public health officials have been shouting from the rooftops for months: getting vaccinated and boosted is extremely effective at protecting against the worst consequences of COVID. People in the U.S. who have not gotten a booster shot are 6 times more likely to die from COVID than those who have. And as for those who haven't gotten a single vaccine dose, they're more than 75 times more likely to die from COVID than someone who's been fully vaxxed and boosted. They're facts that make vaccine mandates feel like common sense to a lot of people, including Boston Mayor Michelle Wu, whose city employee mandate is being challenged in court. Last week, a judge temporarily halted the requirement after Boston police and firefighter unions sued to overturn it. And as for her proof of vaccine requirement for public indoor spaces, that's getting pushed back too. The Massachusetts Restaurant Association sent a letter, this is according to the Boston Herald, saying, quote, some Boston restaurants are losing as much as $15,000 a week because of the policy, an issue Mayor Wu addressed in part when she spoke yesterday.
This is such a tough time for our small businesses, so I really want to encourage everyone to go out there, shop local. We're doing everything we can on our end to keep the workforce safe, keep our customers and the public safe. We're also putting out grants that should open up in the next week or so, so that small businesses that have been hit hard can apply for some relief.
I'm joined now by one of the people helping Mayor Wu through it all, Executive Director of the Boston Public Health Commission and the head of Mayor Wu's COVID-19 Advisory Committee, Dr. Bisola Ojikutu. Doctor, it's very good to see you again. Thanks so much for your time.
Hi, thanks for having me.
In the last couple of weeks, Mayor Wu and the head of the Restaurant Association joined us on our radio show. I want to play for you first what Mayor Wu said 3 or 4 days after the mandate went into effect for restaurants, gyms, etc. And about a week later, what Bob Luz, head of the Restaurant Association, had to say. Here they are.
It's been very, very smooth. That implementation has been pretty smooth all across the city.
It's having an effect on business, and it's having an effect on different parts of it. I mean, we have large events that are withdrawing from the city. We have trade shows rescheduling. We have regional bus tour operators now saying they're going to skip Boston and just go to Newport, New Hampshire, Maine. And, you know, we've had problems at the front door.
Doctor, it seems to me they can't both be right. Who is?
Well, I think that it's just different perspectives. I realize that what's happening now in terms of our businesses is just tough. I mean, the pandemic has been tough on businesses and entertainment. And certainly we're in the middle of a surge. We're still, you know, though we're cautiously optimistic that our numbers are going in the right direction, the fact that we're in the middle of this surge certainly may dissuade people from going out and eating in restaurants or engaging in entertainment activities. So certainly that may be a factor, not just the issue of the indoor proof of vaccination requirement. But the other thing that's it is a more positive note is that we have seen, you know, fewer complaints, fewer issues in relationship to the indoor vaccine proof of vaccination requirement than maybe we anticipated. And you know, on Mayor Wu's COVID-19 Advisory Committee, we have a number of business leaders who actually welcome the city taking a leadership role in this regard. So I have to say that it's been a positive step in the right direction, and definitely a positive initiative.
So to be clear, when Bob Luz says that some restaurants are losing $15,000 a week, it is conceivable that that's true, but I think you're suggesting, sadly, that may be the cost of dealing with this pandemic now so that we're rid of it sooner rather than later. Is that a fair characterization of where you are?
I think so. I mean, I think that some of this is a bit of a trade-off in a sense. I think that, you know, we were at the point in terms of our vaccination citywide where if you compare the number of people who were, sort of getting their first vaccine dose week to week, we were rather stagnant. We were sort of flat in terms of uptake. And it wasn't until, we instituted this mandate and other things happened. We really ramped up access. We really put forth a strong effort in terms of media campaign to get people vaccinated. Sure. And it's just so critically important to ending the surge and for protection as we move forward with COVID and living with COVID-19 that we had to do something.
Let me ask you what I asked Mayor Wu when she was on the radio with us a couple of weeks ago, roughly. This will make the Restaurant Association even less happy. If we're going to have a vaccine mandate in Boston to go into restaurants, and we know that the booster not only limits the spread, but also makes the boosted person safer, why is fully vaccinated as of February 15th not including a booster, say come, I don't know, March 1st or March 15th, assuming the mandate's still there?
So you're absolutely right. Boosters are incredibly important in terms of protecting people from severe illness and hospitalization, decreasing emergency department and urgent care utilization, as well as decreasing symptomatic and asymptomatic illness. But you can't get boosted until you get vaccinated. So you have to get your primary series. So this is a first step. I think our goal as a city is to remain nimble, to follow our data, and to do what we think is best in terms of taking those first steps to getting us where we want to go. As a city, we're probably around 48% boosted, and I think we have a lot more work to do, but that work is on the horizon. It's definitely something that we're working on every single day.
So at some point, being boosted may be added to the definition of fully vaccinated. That's what you're saying, correct?
Well, I think the terminology is already changing. So fully vaccinated does incorporate just the primary series, but what I think is happening nationally is changing the sort of the phrasing to up to date.
No, I want to be clear. No, I'm sorry. Maybe you didn't understand. Is there a point at which, if the vaccine mandate stays in place to get into a restaurant, for example, that it won't just be 2 shots as of February 15th? At some later date, it might be 2 shots plus a booster. That's what I'm asking. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I actually understand your point. Okay. I think that we have to look at all options on the table. We need to protect our populations from, as I said, severe illness and hospitalization. So as we look at our metrics, we will remain nimble and look at all options in this ever-evolving pandemic.
And the mayor's also said, I think it was in mid-January, that there's a small business relief fund which is going to be giving grants, I think up to maximum of 10 grand per business, to help 300, give or take a few numbers of small businesses get through this difficult period. When is that happening?
So I have to say I don't have the answer to that. I apologize. I'd have to get that to you after this.
Okay. Let's move to the mandate for city employees. I know you can't talk about the ongoing litigation with the public employee unions. I can, by the way, even though you can't. And the fact that the Patrolmen's Union is saying no and is requiring something be given them, and that 2 free mental health days is not enough is just unbelievable to me. But let's go beyond that. It's working, is it not? The reality is the mandate for employees is causing the numbers of vaccinated city employees to skyrocket. Is that not correct?
That is correct. I mean, most city employees are now vaccinated. I believe that the last number was 94, 95%. And we anticipated this. So mandates normalize vaccination. They make it routine, standard practice. And we know that it works. School-based vaccination works. School-based vaccination mandates work. Vaccination amongst workers in healthcare settings, that also works. So it's an important strategy to use when you really need to get to the point where we get, most of the population vaccinated.
Do you not worry? There was a story in the Globe the other day about the Boston Teachers Union suggesting that for those who are unvaccinated in their numbers, and the Globe mentioned that somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% of the kids in the Boston public school system are either Black or Latino. Only 42% of their teachers are Black or Latino. The suggestion from the BTU was that the mandate will have a disproportionately negative effect on teachers of color. 1, do you find that to be an accurate assessment? And 2, if it is, does it not worry you?
So I think that my concern is to get everybody vaccinated and boosted so that we can address, or that will address many of the disparities, the very stark disparities that we've seen throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. A central focus of public health is the pursuit of health equity, right?
Sure.
So if you take an intervention like vaccination and you apply it uniformly and universally, and those positive effects that we just talked about in terms of decreasing severe hospitalization, decreasing severe illness, decreasing emergency department and urgent care utilization, you are even closer to achieving the goal of eliminating inequity. So all of the people who are in the racial and ethnic groups who have been suffering from inequity throughout this pandemic, we can close that gap and eliminate some of those disparities if we apply vaccination universally.
Can we return just for a second to the small businesses, well, all businesses, but small businesses in particular that I know Mayor Wu and you are particularly concerned about? There's no end date. It seems to me that if I were in their position and was troubled by this mandate, whether it's as a concept or not, or purely because it's hurting my bottom line, if I knew either what the end date was or what the end date was tied to, a certain positivity rate, a certain vaccination rate, it seems to me it'd be more tolerable to get through. Is that going to be made public at some point? Do you know what the point is once reached would cause the vaccination mandate to enter a restaurant or a gym or a performance venue would disappear? Do you know that?
So we're actually looking at our metrics every single day to determine when we think that it would be appropriate for us to, adjust policymaking or adjust this particular policy accordingly. The reality is that across the country, in those jurisdictions that have implemented similar indoor vaccine, proof of vaccine requirements, they are also looking at their metrics on a regular basis. So we're going to follow our positivity rate. We're going to follow our hospitalizations. All of this is trending in the right direction, and we'll make changes accordingly. I don't think that this is meant to be something that's indefinite.
No, I understand, but let me just one last question, if I may. Is it possible that you will announce before the fact that when we reach, and I'm making up a number, 10% positivity or 83% fully vaccinated, that's the trigger which would end the mandates? Is it possible that could be announced?
Absolutely. That's the point of looking at our data on a regular basis and determining where we think it might be appropriate and safe for people to, engage in activities without having this indoor proof of vaccine requirement. And so we're looking at our vaccination rate as a city. We're 70.5% fully vaccinated, 48% boosted. Our hospitalizations are trending downward, but they're still high. Our overall community positivity rate is 17%. That's down from a high over 32%. So as we follow those, we will come to what we're calling a threshold. And at that point, we can shift in terms of our policies.
Dr. Ojikutu, thank you so much for your work and your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Using his famous name to spread anti-vaccination lies is nothing new for Robert Kennedy Jr. For years, he's pushed debunked claims about vaccines causing autism and food allergies in kids. But his latest lies about vaccines have veered into new, even more dangerous territory, as we saw the weekend before last when he spoke at a D.C. rally against vaccine mandates.
Even in Hitler's Germany, you could cross the Alps into Switzerland. You can hide in an attic like Anne Frank did. It was possible. Many died doing it, but it was possible.
That's the son of Robert F. Kennedy. But the immediate condemnation from just about every corner ultimately led RFK Jr. to issue a half-hearted apology, saying, "To the extent my remarks caused hurt, I am truly and deeply sorry." But this wasn't even the first time he tried to make the comparison. Just last month, he put out a video that showed Dr. Anthony Fauci with a Hitler mustache. And then there's Joe Rogan. Spotify chose him and his 11 million listeners over Neil Young. But don't worry, old Joe plans to diversify his guest list. What, with Ivanka and Don Jr.? So how do we combat misinformation so wrong, so deadly, and so easy to find? Joining me to discuss are Imran Ahmed, he's the CEO of the Center for Countering Digital Hate, and Jeffrey Blevins, professor of journalism at the University of Cincinnati. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Imran, you're the guy, and yours is the organization behind the Disinformation Dozen, which includes Robert F. Kennedy Jr. list. Could you tell people what the list is and how wide the reach is of those dozen?
The Disinformation Dozen was a report we published in March 2021, which outlines how 12 individuals and the companies they control, often a network of 501c3s, limited companies, are behind 65% of the shares of misinformation on social media. So they're producing the content that is going most viral. We did the analysis by looking at, well, what are the themes that are being posted most often? What are the links? And track them back to these 12 people. And that's had a big influence on changing the perception of misinformation, disinformation about vaccines from being something which people thought was just spontaneously there in society to something that is a planned, ordered, well-disciplined, and economically motivated phenomenon.
When you say economically motivated, you also demonstrated that the some, if not all, of these dozen are making a ton of money on their deadly information, no?
Well, indeed. And in fact, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. earns $250,000 salary from the Children's Health Defense, or we did 2 years ago. We don't know what his most recent salary is. But that's quite a lot of cash. It's more than I earn. And we know others like Joe McCullough, the number one on the list. He claims to have made $100 million over the years, selling all sorts of supplements and other weird things which he attributes magical powers to.
And by the way, Kennedy's organization, from what I've read, has gone from roughly $1 million in revenue 3 years ago to almost $7 million now. Jeffrey Blevins, you've also done research on bad information and the sources, hydroxychloroquine in particular. Who do we attribute that bad information to other than Donald Trump himself?
Well, yeah, former President Trump got a lot of the blame for that. But originally, misinformation about hydroxychloroquine on Twitter originated from just a few QAnon-related accounts. It wouldn't have spread, however, for, people like Donald Trump and a lot of right-wing personalities on social media. They are really, the influencers in these kinds of conversations. And the problem is, well, what if our influencers really aren't informed enough to be talking intelligently about medical issues, vaccines, and the like?
Or choose not to be informed enough. Jeffrey Blevins, staying with you for a second, the most recent battle on this front has been the Neil Young versus Spotify and Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan won, and I'm assuming it's all about the bottom line, a $100 million exclusive deal with him for his podcast, and obviously Spotify's moving more into the podcast business. It's all about the bottom line, right?
Absolutely. Spotify has 100 million reasons to be invested in Joe Rogan at this point. And, they didn't make that investment lightly. Quite frankly, they're making more bank off of him than, the musical artists that have left the platform.
Imran, thanks to your terrific work on this Disinformation Dozen, there's been a ton of deplatforming of these dozen. How effective has that effort been?
Well, deplatforming is incredibly effective because, essentially, if you don't allow people to use the most powerful megaphones in human history, social media, then you take away their ability to proselytize, to preach nonsense to vast audiences. And we've seen that those individuals who have had their platforms taken away, not only has it reduced their reach, but we've seen, for example, in some of the litigation they filed against companies like Facebook and Google, they themselves admit that it's devastated their income. They're not complaining about not being able to get the truth out there. They're saying, I can't make money from the nonsense I was spreading.
But it seems to me that this business is like whack-a-mole. Is when I was reading, a month or so ago, Imran, about the deplatforming success, then all of a sudden we started reading about the 11 million listeners to every episode of Joe Rogan. So you tamp down one and another pops up in his or her place, don't they?
Look, I think we have a problem which is beyond the bad actors. We have a culture that is problematic as well. So it's not just bad actors, we have bad platforms. And the culture that enables them is this idea that for some reason there should be different set of social mores, of the norms of behavior on social media platforms, that misinformation and spreading it should somehow be acceptable, and there should be no consequences for a company that profits from it or from an individual who spreads it themselves. Well, I'm afraid there should be, and quite rightly what we're seeing with Spotify is an enormous amount of opprobrium being heaped upon them by all sorts of sectors in society, by lawmakers, by other artists, by shareholders, and they're clearly feeling the pressure because they've come out in the last few days with a statement saying that they're now going to put warning labels on their own service, warning saying essentially, don't listen to the nonsense you hear on this station because we publish all sorts of rubbish.
Yeah, warning statements this big, and Joe Rogan, though, this big. Jeffrey Blevins, I am always been a huge believer in hearing both sides, but when there aren't both sides, I remember, I don't know, a half dozen years ago, the Los Angeles Times said they wouldn't publish any more letters from climate change deniers because they didn't have any merit. Should we in the mainstream media, and I know there's a lot of media beyond us, should we in the mainstream media not even be giving oxygen to the RFK Juniors and the other people we're talking about here? Or do we have no choice?
To be honest with you, I don't think it matters either way. I thought your whack-a-mole analogy was quite a good one in the sense that, once, these purveyors are deplatformed, it's too late. The genie is out of the bottle. Here's another thing, too. When we're talking about medical misinformation, there was an interesting study that came out of George Washington University, and they looked at kind of the total period from March of 2020 to late last year. And there's actually more credible information about vaccines and COVID than there is misinformation on social media. However, it's just not getting the same type of traction. So, it's really not a matter of, do we elevate one or do we silence the other? I think we really have a knowledge crisis in this country, particularly on social media, is that most people, can't tell the difference between credible sources and incredible sources. And, people are really going online to confirm their own biases anyway.
So that seems to me to be, I hope you take this the right way, pretty defeatist attitude. Maybe it's real, but so is the bottom line is grin and bear it and just hope this is over at some point, Jeffrey?
Well, I feel like there's only so much that us in journalists, as in the journalism industry can do. At some point, the audiences have to start caring about, what the truth is, and start caring about credible sources of information versus incredible ones. And until that changes, at what point, do individuals have to be responsible for the information they consume?
Imran, do you buy that notion that it's got to sort of play itself out until people grow up and get real?
One of the unique things about US law when it comes to internet companies is something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act 1996. So 25 years ago, Congress legislated to give tech companies immunity from any civil or criminal liability for the content on their website made by a third party. And 25 years later, that was before social media even existed. 25 years later, that has allowed a culture of essentially a lack of responsibility, a lack of a duty of care to users to not just emerge legally, but also culturally as well. And I think that we can push back on that. And what we've seen, I've been in this game for 5 or 6 years now. Until last year, people asked me, are you sure there's any offline harm caused by online malignant activity? And I would argue that there was. But after January the 6th and the pandemic, no one is asking me that question anymore. So I think we are now on an inevitable sort of path to legislation and to accountability for these companies coming into place, including for Spotify, which is publishing stuff which has led, and misinformation has led directly to people right now, as we're talking, lying in intensive care units, choking for breath, saying, I thought the vaccine would harm me.
You know, Imran, I agree with your analysis completely, except don't you worry about dramatic changes to Section 230? The good news is it may help fix this problem. The bad news is it's a really slippery slope when it comes to the smaller guy or woman having access to ability to spread their legitimate ideas when the Facebooks might just not take a chance.
Well, no, hold on a second. When the big actors themselves are behaving so badly, and yeah, there's this argument that it would harm small businesses the most. Well, in fact, all that you would do is if you remove this immunity clause that they've got, you would make them like every other business, small, medium, and large in America, which is that you have a duty of care to your customers. And if you do not act responsibly, and if a responsible person would turn around and go, "Gosh, you've been really irresponsible in your duty of care to your customers and users," then they may be liable, but they would essentially be like the rest of us. And there are no kings in America. You know, one of the things I like about this country.
There actually are some kings in America, but I know what you mean. Jeffrey, you're going to sign on?
Not beyond the law itself.
Understood. Jeffrey, you going to sign on Imran's campaign about Section 230 or no?
Well, with a couple of caveats. One is that another person who wants to get rid of Section 230 is former President Trump. And I do worry about what could be some of the byproduct of that.
By the way, Joe Biden has criticized Section 230 as well, by the way, not just Trump.
That's true. That's true, but I really think this is more of an economic issue, and we could still sanction companies like Spotify and Twitter by taking our attention elsewhere.
One last thing for both of you. One of the worries, I worry a lot about what you two worry about for a living, but I also worry about this anti-science explosion movement, whatever you want to call it, even post-COVID. Jeffrey, starting with you. Does it survive and last beyond COVID? Because I'm afraid it does.
I'm afraid it does too. I know I'm a bit of a pessimist here, but I think it goes again back to we really have a knowledge crisis in this country, and expertise, scientific expertise has been politicized and demonized, much like journalists have.
Imran, how about you?
I think that the war against science by some people has been accelerated in COVID, but it's been going on for some time, and it's the drip of misinformation over a long period of time that has recolored the lens through which many people see the world and see scientific debates. And even if this crisis abates, and if the sort of the great anxiety that has driven a wave of conspiracism abates now, we are still going to have to deal with the long-term changes that are happening in societies all around the world, because they fundamentally impede our ability for collective action on really important things for our kids, like climate change, but also for the very the integrity of our democracy. And that's the most precious thing that we have to preserve.
Imran Ahmed, Jeffrey Blevins, I really appreciate your thoughts. Thanks so much for your time.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
That's it for tonight. Please come back tomorrow. Interim Suffolk County District Attorney Kevin Hayden joins me on his agenda and if he will seek election to the office he was just appointed to by Governor Baker. Plus, Secretary of the Commonwealth Bill Galvin on his historic run for an 8th term in office. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thank you for watching. Please stay safe.